everybody. Back here, Bicycle Day special. Me and Kyle, joined by Lenny Gibson. I'm excited to dig in. So, you are a major contributor in Kyle and I's worlds. So, and you have a robust history with psychedelics, LSD included, and holotropic breathwork and Stan Grof and a lot of fun stuff like that. So that's why we have you here, and we're really, really excited that you're able to join us for it. So thank you for that. And yeah, I guess before we really get into all this fun with Bicycle Day and fact-checking people, which I can't wait to do, can you tell us a little bit about how LSD kind of came on your radar?
Because a friend gave me some.
It's the usual scenario, isn't it? That's fun. And in all of your storytelling, you always had some really great examples of how things struck you. I remember your story of your first cannabis experience being mind-blowing, and then LSD probably being even more so. And
actually, after the marijuana, it was Heavenly Blue Morning Glories.
Oh, so Morning Glory came before LSD for you. Interesting.
Yeah, I like to work my way up.
That's great. I've always considered trying that, but the risk of the stomach pain always sounded so severe. But I think the technique is better now.
Use a water extraction. The active alkaloids are water soluble. The ones that give you stomach distress are not. So you grind up the seeds, soak them, and then drain them through filter paper.
I did that once, but I drank everything and terrible stomach pains, and it was not fun.
Was it psychoactive for you?
Oh yeah. It was pretty mild, but the pains that followed.
You didn't filter it?
No, dumb 19-year-old, not really kind of paying attention to the instructions.
You should have taken chemistry in high school.
When, Lenny, did you start realizing that psychedelics, including LSD, were quite interesting for you?
The first time.
Was there anything about it in particular that was inspiring?
Well, I was a philosophy major, and I was in my senior year. I was in the summer of my senior year, before my senior year, that I had that first experience with marijuana. And that was pretty interesting. And I had studied Whitehead was the guy who was one of the central people that I learned about in philosophy. And I had some capability with his terminology and concepts. And in that first marijuana experience, I realized, in terms of feeling, his statement that time and space are abstractions. I could deploy the concept, but I didn't have a felt experience behind it. But my first my experience with marijuana gave me the felt experience that supported the conceptual statement that time and space are abstractions. That was interesting because even though I was thoroughly engaged with Whitehead's philosophy, it was a conceptual engagement. And my experience gave me my first experiential engagement with this concept.
What is the term of art now? Experiential philosophy that you're using at Dream Shadow, or did you land on one you like?
What term of art for?
So in Dream Shadow workshops, we're kind of you're often mixing philosophy, kind of lecture and conversation with experientials. And there's some sort of, you had a name for it a while ago.
Applied philosophy is
Applied
what you've
philosophy.
used.
Well, I think of breathwork as applied philosophy.
Yeah. Can you explain that a little bit to folks who might not get that concept?
Well, in modern times, easily since Descartes, and you could push it back into the Middle Ages, philosophy has been taught as an intellectual endeavor. For Plato, philosophy was, and Socrates and people, philosophy was an applied endeavor, was a practical. They didn't make the distinction between intellectual and practical in terms of philosophy. Plato thought that doing philosophy was both a practical and a conceptual endeavor. So, but certainly by the time of during the Middle Ages, philosophy became Plato was lost to the Middle Ages except for the Timaeus. And Aristotle was called the philosopher in the Middle Ages. And in the Middle Ages, philosophy became reduced to what's called a handmaiden of theology. Theology was the premier endeavor. So philosophy was just looked on as supplying technical ideas to theology. So, and Descartes carried that on in spades. Modern philosophy became an intellectual endeavor, even though by the time Descartes, Plato had been rediscovered. But the idea that philosophy was mainly an intellectual endeavor was how Descartes looked at it, even though his pivotal experience was his existential realization that in order for him to be deceived, he had to exist. Descartes was concerned with the question of the existence of God, which had always been the question during the Middle Ages. There were a number of arguments for the existence of God. Anselm's argument, Augustine's argument. So Descartes was looking for another argument for the existence of God, and that question of the existence of God came down to questioning his own existence. And as he sat by the stove, in the stove, the pool, P-O-U-L-E, was the French term in Bavaria, which you could think of as a little bit like an isolation tank. And as he sank into his meditative mood and was wondering about the existence of God, he also began to wonder about his own existence. And then it occurred to him that even if God were a completely evil being whose whole purpose was to deceive him about his existence, in order to be deceived, he had to exist. And then from that, when he came to that realization, then he went on and began to develop his metaphysical scheme, which we're still bound up in today.
So I just, go ahead. Sorry.
Go ahead.
I just wrapped last weekend being at an interesting conference, the first ever conference of the work of Dr. Ian McGilchrist, and it was very interesting. And this concept came up quite a bit from a multidisciplinary perspective. So everybody from physicists to fiction writers to philosophers and futurists, biologists even. It's fascinating.
Yeah, McGilchrist is a pretty good guy. He is one of the most important, he's one of the first major psychologists, psychiatrists who pays attention to Whitehead. Unfortunately, he doesn't seem to have heard of Stan Grof. I don't know if Stan's name came up.
People asked him about psychedelics at one point, and he seemed wholly ignorant of the psychedelic topic in terms of a Grofian perspective. And yeah, it was a little unfortunate. Somebody did ask him about psychedelics, and he said he tried a few times and it never worked for him. And there seemed like an ignorance on the depth psychology traditions generally, if I'm being honest too.
He's English. He's English. The English don't believe in psychology.
Let's have you expand on that so we don't get in too much trouble with our British friends.
John Locke, David Hume. Psychology has nothing to do with anything. It's all sensation. What you see is what you get. The idea of depth isn't there. That's why sex is rare in England.
May or may not be
No
true.
sex,
I don't know.
please. Don't you know that play, No Sex, Please? We're British.
No. Oh my God. No, that's funny. But it's reminding me, I had an interesting conversation with Robin Carhart Harris not that long ago. He let me in his office somehow. And it was tough for him, I'm sure. But I asked him about his origins. Robin. And he had kind of a Freudian Grofian entrance into the space, but then came quite mechanistic, which is interesting.
He started out that way. I wrote a paper in which I used his Freudian interest as a focus. It's around here someplace. And I was quite interested. I came across him on YouTube and started digging into some of his stuff. But indeed, the last time I was at a conference at which he attended virtually, he was a mechanic. I was disappointed because he had been off to what I thought was a good start, but I don't know what happened to him.
I don't. Yeah, I could speculate all day, right? But I think that's the kind of thing that gets funding. What he does now.
Money is what counts.
Right, and it helps you publish in meaningful journals, I guess.
Yeah,
by his estimation.
Numbers.
But he did admit to being coming at things quite mechanistically in the episode. But I didn't really challenge any of his philosophical kind of frameworks in person.
Well, he's not philosophical anymore. He's just a mechanic.
Right.
And mechanics can make good money.
Right.
Especially with millennial mechanics are very rare, so there's money to be made.
So, Kyle?
No, I was just going to say, soon it's going to all be robots.
Right. So, no, it's interesting because there will be a certain level of progress from his kind of work, but it's definitely still captured in this Cartesian model.
No, there won't be any. We have come to a dead end, Joe. Cartesianism we've gone as far as we can go with Cartesianism, and we're in a cul-de-sac.
Why do you say that?
There's no future. The Cartesian paradigm is exhausted. It does not support any useful explanations anymore. I mean, the Cartesian paradigm cannot handle quantum mechanics. Do you remember Mark Epperson at that conference in Claremont?
He was referenced at this last weekend's conference.
Yeah.
By the way, the quantum physicist at the event this weekend doesn't want to call it quantum mechanics anymore because it has a Cartesian twang to it. She calls it quantum theory.
But
yeah, Epperson.
Reich said, Wilhelm. I've got my Reichs all mixed up here. I'm not Heisenberg. Heisenberg says that quantum mechanics is Platonic. He says that's the only way you can understand quantum mechanics from Plato's point of view, and the language is mathematical, which Plato, he didn't have the advantage of modern science, but Plato would understand quantum mechanics quite readily. It's an attempt to describe an ideal realm, and mathematics is one of the best languages for describing the ideal. But most of the people that claim to be talking about quantum mechanics don't understand it. They look at it from a Cartesian point of view. And it's understandable because our culture is utterly Cartesian. You learn the Cartesian worldview from the time you get to kindergarten, probably even preschool these days. And it's like, it's the old fish in the water thing. Fish don't know they're in water. Only when they get pulled out of it do they begin to wonder what the hell is going on.
If quantum mechanics were to move beyond the Cartesian paradigm, what would that look like? For those that maybe don't really know like what we're talking about here, like can you give an example of like maybe some of your thoughts around that?
Whitehead at one point in Science in the Modern World says, in an important sense, everything is everywhere. And that's a very basic description of a quantum particle. It's everywhere.
And he wrote that actually before entanglement was discovered.
Oh, way before.
Yeah, which is fascinating.
There had only been 3 subatomic particles uncovered. But Descartes' paradigm suffers from what Whitehead calls the fallacy of simple location, i.e., a thing is just where it is. The table is just in the corner of the room. From the quantum point of view, every particle in the table is everywhere. It's just focused at a certain point. But so the Cartesian paradigm does not work because it embodies what Whitehead calls the fallacy of simple location. And the basic verbally expressed idea you need to understand quantum mechanics is that in an important sense, everything is everywhere. Every particle is everywhere. It just has the highest probability of being at a certain. But you can only describe quantum mechanics in terms of probability, not in terms of right there. So we are at the end of the Cartesian run. I can talk about it intellectually, but in terms of historically, we're at the end. The only way to get beyond the planetary crisis that climate change is bringing into view is to understand the world organically, not in terms of economics, not in terms of climate elements, okay? But financialization, which is the other big manifestation of climate change. I mean, the other big manifestation of Cartesianism. Basically, culturally, our understanding of the world, our approach to the world is financial. Even environmental impact statements are all about financial impact. So, and we're never going to solve the climate problem with financial calculations, because money is an utter abstraction, and the Cartesian world is a world of abstractions. Money is more important than value. And my 2 favorite sentences from Science in the Modern World are one, Whitehead saying that value is the word I use for the intrinsic reality of an event. That is central. If you can grasp that idea, that's the key to understanding Whitehead.
Could you repeat that one again?
Value, Whitehead says, is the word I use for the intrinsic reality of an event. And then as a corollary to that, he says, limitation is the price of value. But so we'll just stick with value is the word I use for the intrinsic reality of an event. So if we're talking about psychedelic experience, to me, the central deliverance of full-blown psychedelic experience is the comprehension that that the world is pervaded by value, that value is the essence of things. that the feeling of value, the fullness of value, is the essence. And value cannot be located is not a material, it's not something you can, it's a feeling. It's utterly a feeling. That's why one of the main reasons I think that Whitehead is the only philosopher since Plato who has a scheme that is adequate to explain, explicate, illuminate profound psychedelic experience. There's no, like I said, you have to go back to Plato. And Whitehead is really, the only difference between Plato and Whitehead is that Whitehead has the advantage of the deliverances of the experiments that have come out of modern science, which experiments fundamentally overturn the Cartesian perspective. So, intrinsic reality and the most important use of psychedelic experience for me is that it allows one to begin to get a purchase on what the idea, on the feeling of intrinsic reality. Reality that escapes, that lies beyond all description. Okay.
Thinking about, I guess we're recording this for Bicycle Day and the impact of LSD. I know that your early experiences also helped you to kind of understand Whitehead, and you wrote some papers around
And
how
what?
You wrote papers around Whitehead and the LSD experience.
Yeah.
How did some of those early experiences really impact you when you were younger experimenting with LSD, and why was Whitehead a philosophy that you really kind of gravitated towards?
Whitehead and Plato. If it hadn't been for them, I might have become stark raving mad.
Can you go a little further? Was it just that it was difficult to make sense of the experiences and they helped, or was it more than that?
Because I got to places that couldn't understand, couldn't explain otherwise. The only way I could understand the feelings in my experience, my feelings, the only way I could understand them was from the point of view of Plato and Whitehead. None of the other philosophers I had studied, none of the theological things I had studied, none of the philosophy, none of the theology did it. They just didn't make sense. My experiences only made sense from Plato, the point of view of Plato and Whitehead. And I spent a fair amount of time reading all kinds of stuff. I mean, I had studied Western philosophy pretty thoroughly, and people were starting to write about a little bit about psychedelic experience. And but nobody was writing really was helpful. Different people had a partial purchase on things. But I was quite interested in Zen Buddhism, and the Buddhists came closer than most Western philosophies. And John Cobb, in his glossary, his word book, his glossary of Whitehead terminology, says that Whitehead and the Buddhists came upon the same problem, that ordinary language, our ordinary subject-predicate language, is not adequate to explain this experience of intrinsic reality. So the Buddhist ploy was to invent puzzles that could not be solved with the discursive mind, koans particularly. Whitehead took a different tack. He was a logician and a mathematician. And so he dug back into the idea of mind that logic and mathematics had come from, and worked to construct a language, a set of terminology in the way a mathematician would, by setting out precepts and building upon them. But he really created a new language, much like quantum mechanics is a new language that's only accessible by mathematics. And I think the main reason that people find Whitehead so difficult is because he is intensely logical, intensely mathematical in his way of trying to make sense of the world. Just as quantum mechanics makes sense of atomic behavior, of subatomic behavior, so Whitehead is trying to make sense with a language that is at least as complex as the mathematics of quantum mechanics. And that's the reason people find him so difficult, because in order to understand him, you have to set ordinary language aside and take very seriously that he's after something that you can't really capture in words. And that's one of the reasons I think that mystical experience is so useful as an approach to understanding Whitehead. And mystical experience at its core is the same as psychedelic experience at its core. That's a whole nother thing. The problem is psychedelic experience is mixed up with all kinds of side effects of substances, and most people get distracted by the side effects and don't make it to the central core. So I think that the problem with mystical experience is it's been pretty rare. And the singular value of Hofmann's discovery is that we have a substance that can facilitate mystical experience that is not culturally bound. Psychedelics have things we call psychedelics, the indigenous substances, indigenous techniques things like bloodletting and that, they're not easy. Either they're not easy or they're bound up with cultural stuff. Okay? So Hofmann's is the first, Hofmann for the first time isolates something that is not culturally bound. And the most important thing to understand philosophy fundamentally is to escape culture. So it's very useful in that sense. But the problem is that because it's not culture bound, most of us have no idea what the hell to do with it. And
we had Osiris on the show recently, and I think this was a major one of his points. Was this
who was that?
Osiris? What's his name?
The
Kyle?
Egyptian guy?
Perhaps
Osiris, something Gomez, maybe. He was part of the philosophy of psychedelics conference that we put on with Exeter from Mexico.
Osiris was an Egyptian god.
This is a different Osiris, probably.
Who was smashed to smithereens and reassembled.
It is a good story. But Osiris is a guy we had on the show recently. He was a contributor to the Exeter World, I think, in Peter and Christine's sphere over there, and he was talking a lot about this, how we're just not having any kind of cultural basis for understanding this can be problematic for a lot of folks.
It is problematic. There are very few people for whom it's not problematic. I mean, it was problematic for me. If I hadn't had Plato and Whitehead, I don't know where I'd be. So that was my cultural framework. But the mainstream education today does not provide the kind of cultural framework you need to understand these powerful substances. And it's not the substances per se that's powerful, but the experiences that they can engender are powerful.
Yeah, you made some good points a while ago that Hofmann's discovery was really kind of the first time where like access to these states became so available, right? Like it's such a potent molecule. You could create millions of doses versus needing to go out and maybe collect a certain plant or fungi and then not having any culture to it. Like, what was it like during those early days when, I'm sure mostly everybody was like, what is this, right? Like, what are we experiencing here?
It was, the so-called psychedelic renaissance of today, it lacks only the terror and paranoia of the enforced draft and the threat of imprisonment. And the music. So today's psychedelic renaissance is exactly the same kind of situation, except that the threat of jail isn't there, the threat of the draft isn't there, and the music ain't there. As Kierkegaard says of the critic, he says the critic resembles the artist to a hair. He only lacks the anguish in his soul and the passion in his heart. So, psychedelic renaissance only lacks the anguish and the passion. Add those and you'll be right back in the 60s.
Huh. Do you suspect Like you lived through the thick of the 60s. Like do you expect with climate change and, other things that could be coming, we could see a pump up of that anguish?
Yeah. I mean, at this point, I have hope for humanity, but no assurance. From Hofmann's discovery, there have developed two trajectories, I think. One is the interest in mystical experience, which was significant, which was more significant in the early days than it is now. Now, the neurological, mechanistic, psychiatric trajectory is the one that's commercial trajectory is becoming the dominant one. And people are bouncing back and forth between those two things. And that's a whole nother situation that's as difficult to sort out as climate change. And I don't know how it's going to work out, but psychiatry ain't going to solve our problems. And the mystical stuff is so bound up with religion and that New Age type psychology that I don't think that's going to do it either. I mean, Whitehead says that how he came to that perspective, how he came to the mystical perspective, was by studying mathematics and logic. And Plato says understanding comes only after long study and close attendance. So the problem with the current engagement with psychedelic substances is doesn't take any study, doesn't take any attendance. You just bingo. There's nothing. But there's 8 billion people in the world, and odds are that a few of them get it. But there's a hell of a lot more that don't. So, I don't know.
So let's bring it back to Albert Hofmann, and this Bicycle Day story. So we talked about some inaccuracies before we started recording.
Well, simple mistakes. The problem with things that are written down is that nobody reads anymore. It's all in his book, My Problem Child. It's all there. But people didn't read it.
So you were saying earlier, April 16th was the first.
April 16th, it says in My Problem Child. April 16th, I was in my lab.
And he had
and I started to feel funny. Mm-hmm. And my assistant helped me get home. Albert Hofmann slept it off. I guess he appreciated my birthday.
When was your birthday?
He was 17th. I was born while Albert was home resting. And on the he he went back to the lab on the 19th, measured out what he thought was a small amount of the substance he'd been working with. And it wasn't just a random thing, because he said he had some inkling even before he created that 25th variation of the ergot compounds. But he measured out his supposedly small dose, because then most medications were measured in terms of milligrams, not micrograms. And then his assistant had to help him get home again, because the bicycle was even more wobbly. But when he got home this time, his family wasn't there. And he thought he was dying. Until they got the doctor, the family's doctor, and checked out his vegetative signs and said, you're fine. Vegetatively. So it's understandable that people who don't read his book carefully would think that the 19th was the big day. But in fact, it was the 16th.
I think culturally people celebrate the 19th because that was like the day he, I guess intentionally took it, versus the 16th where it accidentally absorbed.
But what was it? His intention was only in the amount he measured out. He didn't have the faintest idea what was going to happen. He just thought he needed to try it again. But so intention was just to try something. But his intention was not to have an overwhelmingly powerful experience. That was furthest thing from his mind. As far as I can tell, he was just, through the 1940s into the 1950s, the research paradigm was, if a chemist came up with something that he thought could be used as a human medication, he should try it on himself. Nowadays, arm's length, don't get contaminated with personal experience. But the research idea that prevailed up through the 50s was, if you aren't willing to try something yourself, you shouldn't lay it on anybody else. And now it's just the opposite. You shouldn't try and... I got almost thrown out of my clinical psychology internship for smiling too much and getting along too well with the patients. But, unless you've had a psychotic episode yourself, it's pretty hard to understand what a psychotic episode is all about. So, but, as I said, the main problem with the missing the date on so-called Bicycle Day is that people don't read. People don't read carefully. And scholarship means paying attention to every word and every punctuation mark. One of my two or three interesting teachers was a philologist named Philip Merlin, who was the world's expert in Plotinus. He assigned us one of Plotinus's lectures for each week of the semester. It was a small class, only 4 or 5 people. By the middle of the semester, we'd almost finished the first assignment. And I sat in on one of his classes. He also taught Aristotle. And at the time I was at Claremont, the political science people at Claremont McKenna College had developed an interest in Aristotle, and the political science people. There's a bunch of political science people in this class. But I decided to sit in on it, even though political science was pretty boring to me at that point. Merlin spent the whole class on a footnote in the translation of Aristotle. A fellow named Werner Jaeger was the world's premier translator of Aristotle. And the first work of Aristotle that he had translated was Aristotle's Metaphysics. At the end of his career, after having translated the whole rest of Aristotle, he went back and retranslated the Metaphysics. And in his translation, on the first page, there's a little footnote. And the footnote says, the manuscript is corrupt at this point. You know, papyrus scrolls deteriorate. So it says the manuscript is just corrupt at this point. And all we have is the root of a verb. Like a leg in Roman, lambda, epsilon, gamma. And the missing part could be either make the verb the third person plural, legate, or the first person plural, legamen. And he said, I originally translated it as I thought that the missing part made the verb the third person plural. But now, having been through the rest of Aristotle's corpus in detail, I think that I should have translated as the first person plural. And the difference is, the first time the translator would be, they, the Platonists, say, which would differentiate Aristotle from Plato. But Jaeger concluded that Aristotle had probably said, we Platonists say. So Aristotle clearly identified himself as a Platonist early in his career. And that makes a whole difference to much of the history of Western philosophy, because as Coleridge said, by the time it got to Coleridge, he said, and the English education that went along with it, all men are born either Platonists or Aristotelians. And that's been the way that the English have taught philosophy, is that you're either a Platonist or an Aristotelian. But the proper thing is to realize that Aristotle was just trying to come up with an additional explanation of what Plato was saying, because that's what scholars do. They start with their teacher and then they try and... but the problem is you end up with people like Aldous Huxley who don't understand Plato because they were educated in the British system, which differentiated between Plato and Aristotle. And in Doors of Perception, Huxley says something like, poor Plato, he didn't understand being. He thought it was some static something. Not true. And Whitehead certainly corrects Huxley's error. So I start to rant about this stuff because, but fortunately, you know, I didn't suffer from the education in the English academies. But my best teacher came from Oklahoma, which is about as far away from England as you can get. even though geographically it's closer than California. But
so a lot of what we keep coming back to here is education, and I guess appropriate education frameworks. And this brings me to another important American thinker, up there, I think, with William James, which is Dewey, who spent a lot of time thinking about education. Is there anything particular there that you think is important to share?
well, Dewey came from Vermont, but he got a little rigid in his old age. He didn't, and whereas James was homeschooled and more broadly educated than Dewey. Dewey, people like Emerson and Thoreau were further away from Dewey. So Dewey became a little rigid, but I mean, he's lumped together with James because of the American philosophy being brought together under the heading of pragmatism. But I had my connection with William James is via a guy named Stephen Colburn Pepper, who I had a couple classes with in my last year of college. And he had matriculated at Harvard in 1910, which was the year that James died. And so he had been educated in James's philosophy department. And he didn't call it pragmatism, he called it contextualism. And I think that's a more useful term, because pragmatism reeks of pragma, things, which is the American obsession, the cash value. So I think Dewey, at the time James went to Harvard, Harvard was still basically a classical education. But the American university system was developing quickly. And World War I made a big impact, had a big impact intellectually on the American university system, because when all these people were recruited for the army in the First World War to be sent over to Europe, many of them, probably the majority of them, only had 8th grade educations. So they weren't vocational, and most of them were farmers. So they had to figure out how to allocate the kinds of tasks that were needed to keep an army going. You know, cooks, infantry, truck, horse. Well, no, they were just starting to get away from horses in the Second World War, but there were lots of different, so they had to sort them out. And that's when statistics came to be used on a large scale. Statistics were used to develop, to test people. Testing was used to separate people by potential vocational skills. And so statistics became a major part of the American university after World War I, and brought with them, of course, numbers, and set us on the road to the quantification of American education. But before World War I, statistics wasn't a big deal in the university. It was mainly I mean, the first statistics came out of agriculture. The Fisher was an agronomist, and the F-test is one of the center pieces of statistics. So the quantification of the American university happened post-World War I. William James was educated, homeschooled, and the first degree he got was an MD from Harvard. So he didn't go to Harvard until, he went to Harvard when Harvard was still pre-quantitative. But Dewey came up in the American system where quantity had already become an important part. So his pragmatism was really much more pragma than was James's. And having spent some time with Stephen Pepper helped me to appreciate that thoroughly. He was a genuine philosopher. Dewey is more of a mechanic. He's working to shape the educational system, whereas James was more concerned with trying to figure out the meaning of things, the nature of things. Dewey, not so much. Dewey had a much more, was oriented towards doing something.
Mm.
So
I'm wondering how we can kind of put a bow on this here a little bit around psychedelics and the future of the movement.
Well, there's great promise, but there's also potentially great disasters. But that's, and that's the whole point. A motorcycle, you go very fast, and those wheels are gyroscopes. But man, if you hit a little obstruction, whoppo!
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's, I would say that of the psychedelic stuff. We're going along very fast with that now. The psychiatrists want to turn it into a drug. I don't know what to call it. I don't know. It used to be called the New Age generation.
You could still call it that.
The airy-fairy stuff, and they don't see eye to eye. Not because there's any evil intent on the part of either, but they're just picking up on two different strands of our culture. I favor the strand that what's his name? This guy, Eugene Taylor, talks about the American folk visionary tradition, which is significantly turned into the airy-fairy part of things. And then there's the quantitative, statistical, psychiatric, and the two are at odds. The truth lies someplace does not lie in the extremes. But will we sort it out? I don't know. I suspect eventually it'll get sorted out, but there may be a lot of trouble in the meantime. Psychiatry is now grasping at psychedelics, see them only as medications, and medications, the primary value of medications is monetary. And that's very powerful in this country because cash value.
You believe that categorically, Lenny?
Categorically.
About medication being primarily financial, like the primary value of medication being financial?
Name the companies. I mean, in America, cash value is what counts in a very, very fundamental way. But fortunately, there's this other wacko side. And we have what Taylor speaks about as the shadow culture. Okay? In Europe, you had the behavioral and the depth psychology themes, which don't see eye to eye ever. Psychology in Europe developed as behaviorism and as depth psychology. That's not how it developed in the US. It developed in the terms that Taylor talks about as it started with the Jonathan Edwards, okay, and all the refugees from Europe who had a fundamentally religious orientation, were utopian in many respects, and the American tradition is very different than the European traditions. And that's why one of my two most important reference points are Stan Grof and Alfred North Whitehead. Both of them came from the European tradition, where it was behaviorism versus depth psychology. And then they came to this country and they ran into William James. Which is totally diverse, which is not, James wasn't on the side of behaviorism or idealism. And that's what those two people, Whitehead and Stan Grof, have been my guiding lights, because they came out of that bifurcated European situation into the American situation, and both of them transcended that bifurcation. And the question is whether we can do it again. You couldn't have two different people than Joe Biden and Donald Trump. I mean, they are such totally, and so we'll see. But I don't know. I'm with William James and the utter diversity of the American experiment. So you guys will have a better shot at me than finding out.
Guess we'll see what happens.
Just remember that I told you so.
Well, thank you so much, Lenny, for joining us today. It's always great to record with you, and I hope we get to be with you in person soon.
Yeah. I appreciate the opportunity to sound off, because that's one of my favorite things to do.
Oh, we know.
Amazing. So could you maybe just say a little bit about Dream Shadow to if people are interested, they might be able to come to some workshops?
Tidetis, tidutis, skiason anthropos. What is anyone? What isn't anyone? A human is but the shadow of a dream. So, dreams.
If anybody wants to learn more, they can visit dreamshadow.com, correct?
Yeah, Dream Shadow. And now we've put up on breathwork.com a more accessible website. So Dream Shadow is the technical website, and breathwork.com is the poetic website.
It's amazing you guys got that domain years ago.
It was fortuitous. And I hope that it will be useful.
Yeah. All right. So yeah, dreamshadow.com and breathwork.com, everybody, if you want to check out more of Lenny and Elizabeth Gibson's work. So Lenny, thank you so much. Joe, it's fun. Thank you.
And thank you guys. I'm hoping that someday you'll become enlightened.
Maybe.
I kind of gave up trying, but we'll see. Maybe I'll reboot the effort.
Well, that's a good first step, Joe.
You're right. Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you, Lenny, and I hope we can do more.
Sure, and thank you for this opportunity.